Good morning, everyone. This is the second in our series of Textile, Two Textiles of Japan. We'll be talking about hon-tsudure. Now, in last year, in our Textile of the Month Group 1, we did go over min-tsudure, and you'll find that on Amazon if you'd, excuse me, you'll find that on YouTube if you'd care to view it, or you'll find a link for it on my webpage, okay? So min-tsudure is going to be a bit different than hon-tsudure. As a general rule, the accepted definition of both in English is tapestry. But as I'll discuss today, it doesn't necessarily mean tapestry weave. Okay, let's go ahead and get started here. And so again, sample 2, hon-tsudure. And here you can see a weaver at work. The thing that most people think is characteristic of tsuzure, certainly characteristic of tapestry weaving, is this back and forth weaving of the textile. I've stopped for just a moment here. So that you're actually creating islands of woven section rather than going directly from selvage to selvage. That's how we think of tapestry. Now, within hon-tsudure style weaving, there are different categories, one of which is called tsume-tsudure, tsume meaning fingernail. And here you can see how the weaver has filed her fingernails into this comb-like shape. Okay, and that allows her to tamp the threads down in place. Okay. I'll show you different versions of that in just a bit. So here she is pushing the threads down in position after using the shuttle to weave that individual section. So I'll stop again just a second here. And so what I want to point out when I'm saying islands, you can see the cartoon beneath through the warp threads. And this gold weft is going to come up to this edge and turn around to go back in the opposite direction and keep going until basically it's created this woven, this petal shape. Then the fill-in green will go section to section, and of course the gold ring around it will do the same. So in each case, the thread is turning around rather than traversing the entire width of the cloth. That's what we think of as tapestry. Okay, and so here again, you can see us focusing in on that detail. Now, notice the comb that she's using to push that in place. So the fingernail goes so far. Obviously, our fingernails are not going to be as strong as the comb. And so an additional comb is used to beat it down in place to make it very tight. One of the key characteristics, and you can see it's just a two-heddle loom, one of the key characteristics of hon-tsudure is that it's very tight. It is a weft face weave. That's one of the definitions. It has to be weft faced, whereas some of the other tapestry type weaves can be balanced or even warp faced. These are some of the selections of threads that they keep. That last drawer that we saw, let me back up just a tiny bit. Nope, come on. Okay. So the labels on them are telling the different colors. This is Nezumi Iro as an example. This one says Matsuba, which means pine needles. And so these are all the pine needle related colors that have been dyed and prepared for the wharf. And of course, here you can see a threaded heddle. Now, remember, if you will, in min-tsudure, a common trait was to have an outline woven. But it's not this kind of outline. The outline in min-tsudure was a single thread traveling independently as it wrapped around. That's very common in min-tsudure, but you don't find that in hon-tsudure. So the outline here is simply a decorative style, and you can see the broad width of it. It's far more than one single strand traveling. Hontsudure can be very subtle, soft colors, or it can be very bright, bold, contemporary patterns. One thing that is common throughout is notice how very tight and dense the weave is. As a very general rule, the threads tend to be thicker than you might find in other types of nishijin weaves, okay? So you can actually see the thickness of the thread very easily with your naked eye. Here again, you see how thick the thread is. Men weave these, women weave these. In the hon-tsudure style, generally speaking, you don't use a jacquard loom or a power loom. It's all done by hand. And here you can see him filing his nails. Now, I don't know if you can actually see this in your computer or not. He's using a saw-like device, and you can see how short his nails are. Other weavers will use more file-like tools and will have longer nails. A lot of that is simply how strong your nails are and what device you have at hand. Okay, so here's a woman doing hers with a file, and you can see how much more pronounced the teeth are on her little saw of a fingernail. Okay, so very often a cartoon is held underneath, and you follow the cartoon by lifting it up periodically so that you can see it very clearly in place. Draw, so to speak, your threads in place following the cartoon. And you can, if you're filling in a large area, the cartoon just drops down for a moment. But what you'll also see in just a moment, the weaver has to periodically double check with a mirror to make sure everything's coming along correctly, because after all, she or he is working from the back. So you see all of these little shuttles are in place, weaving their own little island. Now, this particular comb, I'm going to stop for a second. What I want to point out to you is how somewhere along the line, either because teeth broke initially or she specifically needed this size, all of the other teeth have been cut out. So she has a very fine, isolated tool to work with, narrow tool. Now, the thing that's just entered the screen is the type of comb that I carry on my website, and I've designed it so that it's a bit thinner. The teeth are a bit longer than are traditional in Japanese ones, only because a lot of my customers like to use thicker piles. Okay, and that's the primary reason for it. And in addition, the tail here is used in doing other types of weaving. But both are nice. You can see it's a little bit more delicate than the traditional Japanese one that she's using. But notice how that allowed her to go in and do an isolated area. Now, in this particular shot, what I want you to take note of is here too, I guess, is how much strength she's putting into it. That's quite a bit of power that's put into beating that thread. And that's what makes the weave so tight. And that's one of the typically characteristic details of hon-tsudure. Now, there are many other type of tsudure weaves that are lightweight, a little bit flimsy, like the mean tsudure, but hon-tsudure tends to be very stiff and very heavy, but not always. Now, here she is pulling the mirror up to double check the right side of the fabric to make sure that everything is coming along nicely. Okay. So how do you go about designing for this? Here, this artist is using the typical, I'm going to stop again, the typical ganryo style, the pigment style paints, the things that we would normally use for those of you who have taken the katazome classes or the bingata classes. These are exactly the same pigments, exactly the same colors we use in that. And you can see she's using a menso fude to do her initial painting. These cartoons are a whole separate industry in itself, cartoon being the base drawing. These cartoons are a whole industry by itself. They'll have, normally a weaving house will have several hundred years worth of cartoons built up over the ages, and that's their wealth of intellectual knowledge stored in those drawings that they can pull out and reproduce at any time or pick and choose elements from it. Now, I want to contrast what she was painting with the hinagata, the cartoon, the hinagata that I have up now. This is a hinagata for an obi, could be for a kimono, but you'll notice the detail of the shading in it is more appropriate to, again, very thinner threads and perhaps a jacquard weave certainly rather than a tapestry weave. Okay, so you see all these delicate shadings, all these details. So in contrast to that, let's take a look at a cartoon that has been prepared specifically for tapestry weave. Now, if we pause this just a minute, you can see there are little striations that are following the weave. They're very sharp edges, very little of that delicate shading that we saw in the previous cartoon. This is how we know this is specifically for a tapestry weave. You can also see little bits here and there where the tapestry of necessity is crossing a little bit outside the line to prevent gaps from forming in the weave. Gaps are typical of tapestry. Okay, so again, larger, more solid, opaque types of islands of color. So once the cartoon is done and decided upon, it's turned over to expert dye producers, dyers, and they'll be using synthetic dyes in this case, and they really have a very keen eye. It's decades of training to develop this skill, and they'll be able to match precisely the images presented in the cartoon. Very, very delicate shadings, gradations of color and variations. Okay, so here we're back at another piece. I'm going to pause again for just a second here. Notice the typically very hard, excuse me, the very hard, compact tsuzure in the background. Now, in this case, she's using a bit larger threads to create slight relief, but it's still all tapestry. I'll point out why this is important in just a moment here. And relative to the shuttle that she's using, this is a shuttle that I designed and had Anthony Kleisis make for me. He's a loom maker. And the difference I want to show you is that the point on this one is a bit longer and a bit thinner, so it's a little bit more easy to use as a pick, okay? Although the Japanese also have ones very similar to that, just depends on the weaver's preference. Okay, and here again, this is a little bit different shaped shuttle than you saw in the previous person's work. And here you can see the scale of the threads to the warp. The warp thread is also fairly heavy. I'm saying all of this in terms of generalities. There are very fine, thin thread tsuzure also, hon-tsudure, okay? But on average, these are harder, stiffer fabrics. And I think you can understand why it would be nearly impossible to do with a jacquard loom, because once more, the pattern does not traverse the weft from selvage to selvage. These little islands are built up one at a time. So when we're talking about tapestry, one of the typical features, because of these islands that are sculpted, when this artist comes back, perhaps with the blue thread, and comes over and butts into that, and comes back and butts into it. If there's this line, if there's a straight line in the design that follows the weft, what happens when it turns around, there's a slit that's formed. Now, typical in Japanese weaving, a great many of the shapes are rounded. Now, if it's rounded, you're stair-stepping up and a slit doesn't occur. It's only really when you have stripes. But that is a telltale sign of being real tapestry. Okay, so you can see what tedious or time-consuming, I should say, work it is to follow the cartoon underneath. I think that perhaps helps you appreciate the quality and the expense also of this type of work. Okay, so this one, it says, is called Hatsuri Ori, and you can see once more you wind up with this somewhat pixelated look, okay, as the thread comes over, hits the tendril and doubles back and hits it again 2 or 3 times, and that's what's forming the stair step here. The circles in this particular piece aren't as round as they might be in larger scale pieces, but round shapes are very difficult to create in this type of weaving that is not computer generated. One other trait of very high quality hon-tsudure is the ability to create this kind of shading. So the thread itself is not shaded. It's just a question with the shuttle of having just one thread peek out and then go back under again. Okay. So it's not all flat and matte in image as I indicated earlier. Whoops, I went by that too quickly. Often what you do is achieve very complex shadings and colors, as we saw a moment ago, by spinning two threads together, by joining them together so that each thread actually has quite a bit of a range of colors in it. Okay, and here again, you can see the type of shading. This is called bukashi ori, shaded weaving, and see how expertly the different nuances of color shading in the hills and the castle have been achieved, even through tapestry. This is typical of Japanese hon-tsudure. Okay, and here's another example of the same thing from a fukusa. A fukusa is a gift cover. Now, in this case, because it's such a small scale image, and because the threads are so large, you do get a little bit more of this jagged shape than you would wind up with in very large coarse images. But here you can see the typical slits that I was mentioning earlier, and they're on the other side also. When a slit is very large, often the Japanese will go back and stitch it closed. And you can see the shading up above. So we're back once more at the crest we talked about earlier, just to review. And this is where you find that kind of crest. This is the back side of the fukusa, okay, the gift cover. These aren't used to wrap gifts. They're used to lay over the top, as you just saw here, um, to cover the gift. So it's kind of like a wrapping. It's covering it from view as you present it, but it's not tied like a furoshiki. It's left square, which is why it's very stiff. It's okay to be very stiff. And they usually have the tassels, or they always have the tassels on the ends of them. Okay, and then the gift itself, in this case, probably money, is in a tray on another tray, covered with the fukusa. And that was the fukusa we saw just a moment ago. The fukusas themselves are quite collectible items. Now, I know you're not feeling this, and this is the drawback of a Zoom type presentation, but this is a fairly stiff fabric for all the reasons that I've mentioned. The warp threads are fairly thick. The weft threads are fairly thick, even if silky, and when they're beat into a very, very dense weft face weaving, you get this very stiff, almost stand on its own kind of fabric. Now, you can have very contemporary patterns, as we just saw, or they're used for things, all sorts of, you can have full kimono or uchikake worn, woven out of the tapestry weave. As you just saw, there's the fukusa, scrolls might be woven, certainly obi are woven, furniture coverings, upholstery, and things like that. All of those tapestry may be employed for those uses. Okay, now I want to also point out to you I'm getting now into the nuts and bolts definition of hon-tsudure. Okay, so what this says, okay, that this is from the Kyoto Nishijin district, and it says that it's tsume hon-tsudure ori. Okay, so again, it's the fingernail weaving, and it's real tsuzure. Okay, and these are the folks weaving it. And this basically says the same thing here. Okay, so tsumekagi is just, again, your fingernail as the tamping device and the business. But what I want to get into here, that was just for the provenance. Notice in this case, we don't have really any of those islands of color that scream tapestry. Okay, and as a matter of fact, some of these threads do actually go all the way selvage to selvage, okay, which is not a tapestry technique normally. So there are little bits. You can see the gold thread comes and turns around and goes back, so that qualifies. It's just not as sculptural as some of the others. But you know what also qualifies as hon-tsudure is this portion. This is hon-tsudure. There's no pattern. There's no sculpting. There's no tapestry. And so that's what I want to point out. The problem with translating languages very often is there are overlapping words. I mean, there are overlapping definitions in any two words where, yes, that's an accurate definition, but the concepts native to whatever culture we're talking about has its own concept of where that particular portion fits into the word. So when we're saying hon-tsudure, it's almost always translated, tsuzure is almost always translated as tapestry. And very, very often it is tapestry, but it's also this. And so if someone in Japan is telling you that something is a hon-tsudure piece, and you look at it and don't see any tapestry at all, the person is still correct. So what makes hon-tsudure the hon-tsudure is the fact that it is a fairly, comparatively, a fairly thick thread, warp and weft. It's always weft face, and it's very, very dense. It used to be if you wanted to sort of give a backhand compliment to somebody, you would tell them how very soft and supple their tsuzure was, which is an insult because that means you're lazy as a weaver and you haven't beat it tight enough to make it as hon-tsudure should be. Okay, so to tell somebody they're so soft and supple simply means that the structure was poorly executed. Okay, so not a good compliment. And I'll go on a bit more why I'm telling you all of this. Okay, so this is a hon-tsudure piece. Okay, and we'll be able to see the tiny slits as we get closer. This is an obi, by the way. And you can actually see, because of the size of the threads and so forth, the structure of the weave, okay? You can start to see some of the little slits around the edges. And another important detail is all the threads are on the same plane, okay? They're all flat, they're all going at the same level. There's nothing, piled up on top. And so here we'll be able to see here, right here, you can see the slits that I'm talking about. And in this case, you can see where the peach color has doubled back and come back again, leaving this gap here. But at the same time, this portion in the back is also hon-tsudure with no patterning. Okay, so this gives you a bit of a close-up on some of the weave structure. So let's go to another obi. This is a Nagoya obi. It too is hon-tsudure, and it's all flat, even plain. The background is very, very dense. Perhaps you can see in the clip how stiff it is. And if we go in again, we can see the gaps here in the tapestry. This is a detail. Now, because it's a Nagoya obi, a hon-tsudure is so stiff it actually doesn't need to be lined. It very often is not lined. It's stiff enough with no interfacing, with no backing, nothing, to be able to tie it and have everything stay in place, which means it's also lighter weight and cooler in some cases. So what I've done here is I flipped it over so you can see the back, since it's an unlined piece. And you can see it's virtually identical to the front. The only thing that's different, if you look closely, is being the back, there are going to be a couple of loose threads on it. Okay, so right here, you can see a few loose threads where they've been clipped later or the thread is ended, and that indicates the back. Other than that, it's virtually impossible to tell the difference. So this is also a tsuzure ori piece, okay, legitimately so. And what makes it so is all of this background. But if we look at it more closely, we can see there's this embroidered-like area. Now, this is the hon-tsudure. So it's a blending of gold threads and white threads. You can see how very densely it's packed. But if we go to the image itself of the cranes, they have very much an embroidered look to it. Now, as it happens, those threads are like a supplemental weft that are going through, okay? But they are not on the same plane. They're raised up because they're over the top of it. Beneath that is still the tsuzure ori structure. And that's why you have to be careful when you're making selections or examining textiles. And this might seem like a really geeky or nitpicky detail, but it's the fun of looking at the structures. Real hon-tsudure, everything's on the same plane, colors but and go back. Or, as I just mentioned, the back can be this solid, dense, weft face. So let's look at another one here. The back is very dense. This is a very stiff obi. Okay. Now, if we look really closely, though, so look right here along the neck. See where the white thread hits the base background? That has very much more an embroidered look to it than a tapestry because there's no turnaround, there's no gap. And for that long a section, there should be at least an occasional gap. There are no gaps in any of this, which indicates to us it's very likely a supplemental weft rather than a tapestry weave, but still tsuzure. So let's, again, this is a Nagoya obi and not line, so we can flip it over and look at the back of it. And this is what you see. So those same shuttles were used. They were employed the same way we saw with the tapestry weave. You're just not going back and forth to create islands. And for that reason, you can do this on a jacquard loom, and you can have repetitive patterns planned out, and you can plan your image set up in the computerized portion of the jacquard so that you can do obi after obi after obi without the mental focus of someone sculpting by hand. So again, more contrast. We have the full tsuzure, or excuse me, we have the full tapestry, which is the tsuzure. We have the background dense weft face, which is tsuzure. And now what I want to show you is one more example that's still tsuzure, technically, and the entire background was woven solid, but all of the imagery, rather than being woven, is painted on using the pigments, same pigments we saw earlier in the cartoon drawings. Now, in this particular case, again, for those of you who are dyers, you'll recognize what's happening here. The white shell has flaked off because the artist painting this obi was actually a scroll painter or a screen painter and not a textile painter. If it's a textile painter, such as the classes I teach, we would use soy milk in combination with the shell, which would prevent this from happening. Although there is a beauty and a charm to this older rustic aging that comes that has its own value, but nonetheless, as the craftsperson doing it, that's not what you intend. So you can see all of the weave structure. It almost appears to be woven because the way in which this has been painted, and we'll have a slide come up here in just a moment, I can show you how misleading it can be at a glance. So this is the fukusa itself. So this is one of the gift covers again. The background character here is happiness for it, okay? It's kotobuki. Okay, now, if we examine this from the slide, it really appears that you have some gaps here. You have these slits here, but it's deceiving. That's actually the black underdrawing that was laid down first, and then this pigment was on top. So where there's a slight mismatch, it gives the appearance of a slit, even though it's not. Now, here again, we have a very beautiful tapestry weave. This is a fukusa, very stiff. Okay, and you can see all of the type of shading that we discussed earlier in this. Very often, fukusa come in sets. There's sort of a small, medium, and large, or medium and large that goes together. And so that's what you're seeing here with the small one. By the way, these gift covers, when you give them with a gift, they're these huge, elaborate, very, very expensive things. The person to whom you're presenting the gift does not keep this. They keep the gift, but the fukusa always comes back to you, so it can be used through several generations. And that's one of the reasons the Japanese invest so much of their resources into producing these exquisite pieces, because they come back. Now, the way that you tell how to give it back to that person is that the family crest is on the back. And this is the smaller one I flipped over for you to see the family crest. So we can tell the background, looking at this enlargement, the background is tsuzureori. Okay, it is the tight, dense weft face. But this part is not. Okay. Let's see. Looking at this now, actually, it appears to me to be couched rather than woven. In couching, you lay a gold thread down and use a separate thread to tack it in place. So you can see the little tiny dot of the thread holding the heavier fiber, the heavier cord down, as the cord does go back and forth. But if you actually look from a detector's point of view, whereas the weave is going this way, the couching is not quite in sync with the direction of the weave, and that's another giveaway. Okay, so very often couching will be used for the crest and other details. So let's go on now towards it. We're almost finished here. I want to show you some of the other favorites from my collection. This is hon-tsudure. It's a real tapestry. It's tapestry also. Beautiful doves in the temple grounds here. And this gives you an idea of what that looks like. There's not a whole lot of shading. Nonetheless, you do get a sense of the moss on the trees by using those combined colors in the threads as they weave. And this is one of my favorites also, only because you don't often see a crane facing you. They look sort of like marshmallows, but usually the cranes are in profile because you show off the beak and so forth. But I'm really fond of this looking straight on. And you can again see the typical slats here. Okay, so this will be the last one for our program today. So I want to thank all of you for joining in. We're done with this portion of it, so I'll go ahead and close this out and ask those of you attending today to go ahead and come back on, and we'll discuss your questions and so forth.